George Washington said in his farewell address, which was given after he concluded his 2 terms in office as president, of all the habits and dispositions that are indispensable to the support of free government, religion and morality are among the surest supports. What he's saying there is really a truth that was affirmed by many of the other, in fact, all of the other founders. And it is that in order to be a free people, Americans had to be a virtuous people. But if you have a nation of people who don't care a bit about morality or virtue, and ultimately have no concern at all for religion, have even a disregard for it, you're not going to be able to maintain that liberty.
Hello, my name is Megan. I'm a senior majoring in politics and Latin at Hillsdale College. This is part of a 10-week course, Constitution 101, presented by Hillsdale College. Today you will hear from Dr. David Bobb, Director of the Alan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship, on religion, morality, and property. Please watch.
The signers of the Declaration of Independence asserted their natural and political rights with what they called a, quote, firm reliance upon the protection of divine providence. This powerful assertion of rights in the Declaration, which was the cornerstone of a new regime, was directly related, the founders argued, to religious and moral duties. These duties, they emphasize in the documents we'll examine now, are universal, just like the rights to which they are inextricably bound. Almighty God hath created the mind free. Thus Thomas Jefferson begins the revolutionary Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which, along with the authorship of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the University of Virginia, were the 3 accomplishments of his about which he was most proud. God gives uniquely to human beings the gift of reason. Even more, he creates all individuals equal in their possession of natural rights. For Jefferson and his fellow founders, God created the human mind free. The freedom of the human mind means that all individuals can choose between good and evil. The founders believe that although human beings are capable of doing great good, they equally are capable of tremendous evil. In the words of Jefferson in the landmark statute of 1786, all people, including those who would rule others, are, quote, but fallible and uninspired men, end quote. The theological conviction of most early Americans, including the leading political lights, was that all human beings are fallen. Politically, this meant that all are fallible. The political, religious, and moral framework of the founding started with the affirmation of a common, enduring, and unchanging human nature. Human beings are admixtures of roiling passions and calming reason. Regardless of time, place, and social or economic status, all share the same propensity to evil. Despite these strong tendencies, man is not condemned to mere animal existence. With careful cultivation of his soul, attention to the laws of nature and of nature's God, and the uplifting assistance of family, church, and local community, an individual is able to tame his passions and live according to the blessings of liberty. As flawed but rational creatures, human beings should strive to let reason, a gift from God, rule their lives, the founders urged. For with that rule comes the possibility of self-government. The implication for politics of this moral and religious conclusion is a profound thing. Every person and every regime or form of government is imperfect and incapable of being perfected by mortal means. The founders concluded that we know the existence of human nature, natural law, and the mind's freedom, not because we are members of any particular church or denomination, but because we are able as human beings to follow reason's path toward these first principles. Reason's dictates are not opposed to those of revelation. On the contrary, the vital truths of human existence are affirmed by both reason and revelation. Reason and revelation together counsel religious liberty. This idea, upheld by all of the American founders, is among the most revolutionary tenets in the history of ideas. Whereas throughout most of human history, religious minorities have lived with the fear of political persecution, and religious toleration, if established, was put in place as a revocable policy. In America, the right to religious liberty was established as a matter of principle. President George Washington expressed this new principle in a letter he sent in 1790 to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. And here I quote from Washington: "It is no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it were by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. The United States," he added, "which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it, on all occasions, their effectual support." End quote. To close his letter, Washington offered his fellow citizens a benediction. Quote, "May the children of the stock of Abraham, who dwell in this land, continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while every one shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there be none to make him afraid." That definition of liberty, quoted earlier in this course by Professor West, drew directly upon the words from the prophet Micah. Can you imagine how it must have felt to hear those words from the newly installed chief executive of your country? Equality in rights is not just a theoretical aspiration, it's a lived reality. A truly landmark statement. The remarkable thing about Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation is that in sending such affirmations to many other congregations, including Roman Catholics, many different denominations of Protestants, and Mennonites, Washington related the same core message to all of them. Religious liberty is a right, and if citizens comport themselves worthy of the right, it always will be theirs. It does not matter if you are a Protestant or Catholic, Quaker, or Jewish. Mere toleration is not the standard established by Americans. These powerful statements Washington made were echoes of earlier policies he had enacted even before he was president. When as general of the Continental Army, he forbade his troops from the imprudence and folly of ridiculing Catholic ceremonies as part of what was called Pope's Day. This action had a practical point. Washington, after all, was trying to wrest Catholic Quebec from the British, but as importantly, it was rooted in principle. How did America come to establish the gold standard of religious liberty? As it turns out, like most rare achievements, winning religious liberty did not come easily or automatically. In fact, it was a struggle, one waged with particularly fierce determination in Virginia. Working together from the mid to late 1770s until the adoption of the Virginia Statute in 1786, James Madison, who was mainly in his 20s, and Thomas Jefferson, who was in his 30s and early 40s, waged an all-out assault on Virginia's establishment of the Anglican Church in what was among the most pitched battles for religious liberty in American history. Before we consider that battle, though, some more political and historical context will help set the stage. Although each was adopted in 1776, two documents from that year will endure as long as liberty itself: the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The Declaration of Independence invokes God 4 times. In it, he is referred to as the laws of nature and of nature's God, Creator, Supreme Judge of the world, and Divine Providence. As others have noted, there is recognition in these references to God as a kind of chief lawgiver, chief executive, and chief judge, that the Almighty himself is the only being capable of holding simultaneously all 3 roles. No mere mortal, no king, no president, not even a man of Washington's towering virtue should be entrusted with the duties associated with all. Those powers must be separated. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, drafted by Colonel George Mason and adopted a few weeks before the Declaration of Independence, was a clarion call to citizens about the permanency of pre-political natural rights. These rights are pre-political in that government is not the grantor of our most precious rights, but rather must act as protector of those rights. As preamble to the Virginia Constitution, the Virginia Declaration is, along with the Declaration of Independence, perhaps the clearest statement of the social contract theory of government. Drawing upon the political theory of John Locke, the founders held that even before human beings form governments, they possess rights, among which is the right to acquire and possess property. Government's duty is to protect the rights of people. Government then is not the giver of natural rights, therefore it cannot legitimately take them away. Virginia's Declaration of Rights, interestingly enough, is also a declaration of duties. Section 15 reads as follows: that no free government or the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, and by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. For the founders, values was an unknown term. Principles, rather, must guide the way, and the practice of virtue must be each person's duty. Section 16 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which follows on the one I just read, is of utmost significance. For after defining religion as the duty which we owe our Creator, it states that, quote, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. While the first draft of this section promised only religious toleration, an amendment from a young James Madison prompted the final version, in which a new entitlement was introduced. Significantly, the only way in which citizens were entitled to anything, the founders affirmed, was in their possession of natural rights, high among which was the protection of the right of conscience. When we look back on the founding and do so within the framework of our own culture and politics, we often neglect just how attuned the founders were to the necessity of virtue. When individuals stray from the narrow path of virtue, most early Americans believed reform or repentance was necessary. In the Fast Day Proclamation of the Continental Congress, which is in the U.S. Constitution Reader, that document comes from 1776, we see a prime example of the scores of such proclamations issued in early America by Congress, and hundreds of others in local communities. This one was written by the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and later president of the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University. And that proclamation indicated that prayer and fasting were part of the process of what it called humiliation, by which the people could turn from all immorality. Only then might God assist the wartime efforts of the colonies, the proclamation upheld. Now, let us consider the struggle for religious liberty in the Commonwealth of Virginia. In 1779, Thomas Jefferson introduced a bill in the Virginia legislature that would fulfill the promise of the Virginia Declaration of Rights by putting the Anglican establishment in Virginia on the path of extinction. In his bill, which begins, as I quoted at the outset of this session, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, Jefferson commends, we might say, three types of humility. A kind of epistemic humility, which says truth will win out. It doesn't need state-backed enforcement. Secondly, religious humility. That is, religious partisans should not coerce others into agreement. And thirdly, political humility. Political powers, no matter what they believe, cannot repeal the natural rights of mankind. Not everyone agreed with Jefferson's position on the matter. And for Patrick Henry, the gravest danger facing Virginia was the erosion of public and private morality. To halt the precipitous decline in public and private morality, Henry proposed a bill in 1784 that would establish funding for teachers of Christianity in Virginia. Henry's bill would have enacted a general assessment whereby Virginians would designate their share to the church of their choice or to a general fund used for public education in the Commonwealth. It was a denominationally non-specific bill, for Anglicans could designate their portion of the tax to the Anglican Church, Methodists to their church, Presbyterians to theirs. Quakers and Mennonites were exempted. Henry's proposed legislation, as opposed to Jefferson's, began with the argument that public support of religion was necessary for virtue to flourish. Henry's bill drew the support of John Marshall, Richard Henry Lee, and George Washington. It drew sharp opposition from Jefferson, Madison, and a coalition of Baptists and independent thinkers cobbled together largely at the inspiration of Jefferson and Madison. The battle lines of this debate are well known, and the rhetorical weapons of Jefferson and Madison are well preserved. Madison's memorial and remonstrance, which we'll look at in a few minutes, was penned anonymously in response to Henry's bill. Recollected far less, however, is how close this contest was. Short of the brilliant gambit conceived and executed by Madison to get Henry elected governor, and thus remove him from the legislative debate, Henry's bill might have passed. It's worth noting, by the way, that Jefferson hatched a more radical plot than that of Madison. What we must do, Jefferson, then American ambassador to France, writing from Paris, what he said to Madison is, we have to pray devoutly for Henry's death. Madison's more moderate plan carried the day. With Henry removed from the legislative debate, his measure stalled, paving the way for the passage of Jefferson's bill, finally in 1786. Were Jefferson, Madison, and their assemblage of opponents to Henry's bill opposed to the need to, quote, correct the morals of men, restrain their vices, and preserve the peace of society? Of course not. Moreover, their rhetoric makes clear that one of their stated aims for disestablishment of the church was to unleash the full ability of religion to influence society. Religious forces could better influence society, they argued, if left unshackled to the state. When the fate of religion is tied to the state, any political problem imperils the reputation and strength of religion. For Madison, all of the discord in Virginia over the support of religion and morality is opposed to good order. As he stated in his memorial and remonstrance, quote, the very appearance of the bill has transformed that Christian forbearance, love, and charity, there he's recalling the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which we looked at just a moment ago, which of late mutually prevailed, into animosities and jealousies, which may not soon be appeased. What mischiefs may not be dreaded should this enemy to the public quiet be armed with the force of a law? In other words, the very thing that they wished to do, the very thing that they sought, was hampered by the establishment of religion. Madison circulated his memorial and remonstrance anonymously as part of the project to pass the Virginia Statute and tear down the Anglican establishment. The memorial marks his effort to educate Virginians and the nation about religious liberty. He defined religion as the duty which we owe to our Creator. And in the memorial, he appealed to religious citizens by emphasizing that Christianity's own internal teachings preclude its politically coerced support. No religion, especially Christianity, should tie its success or failure to that of the state, Madison urged. In short, religion's integrity must not be destroyed by the arrogant pretensions, as he called them, of the state to establish it. The passage of the Virginia Statute set in motion disestablishment movements in other states. And although it took much longer in many New England states for the official churches to be stripped of their power, eventually all of the original 13 states came to mirror the federal Constitution in barring an official church and guaranteeing religious liberty to all. Even in a battle as fierce as in Virginia, there was an agreement about the importance of belief in God and about much else of fundamental import. The question open to debate is how best to allow people to worship God and provide for the support of their beliefs. Jefferson did not seek to drive religion out of the public square, but instead sought an end to measures in Virginia he deemed coercive of public support for religion. Yet his opposition to the public support of Anglicanism in Virginia still caused a clamor. To Jefferson's statement that it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God, it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg, a former congressional chaplain retorted, let my neighbor once persuade himself that there is no God, and he will soon pick my pocket and break not only my leg, but my neck. The matter at stake here was an important one for the founding generation, but it's equally important in our age. What keeps men from picking their fellows' pockets or breaking their neighbors' legs or necks? In other words, what makes human beings moral, the kind of people who will be good and good citizens? In 1787, just after the passage of the Virginia Statute, the Northwest Ordinance was adopted by Congress, governing the new massive territory that eventually became what now are the Midwestern states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, the Northwest Ordinance stated unequivocally that, quote, the fundamental principles of civil and religious liberty are the basis whereon these republics, their laws and constitutions, are erected. The purpose of the ordinance is the extension of these fundamental principles. Because no human being is born innately good or full of virtue, the inculcation of virtue through education is essential. This axiom of early American community life finds rich expression in Article 3 of the ordinance. And here I quote from that. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, school and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Inescapably moral in its claims, education for the founders, undertaken with local control, was the means by which the citizenry became capable of self-government. The Constitution of the United States itself, which was adopted shortly after the Northwest Ordinance, says little about religion, with the notable exception of banning religious tests for federal elected officials. There is no other explicit mention of religion in the body of the Constitution. When President Washington assumed office after the Constitution's ratification, the Bill of Rights had not yet been added to the Constitution, of course. The structure of the Constitution itself is the greatest bulwark to religious liberty. As Washington stated in that letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. The addition of the First Amendment's religion clauses, as they've come to be called, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, strengthened the basic structure of the Constitution. They sent the message to the states that disestablishment of their state religions was the right course of action, and that in America, all should enjoy free exercise of liberty. Like President Washington's pedagogical letter to the Hebrew congregation and many other similar letters he sent to other religious groups, his farewell address both exhorts and teaches. Washington encourages his countrymen to elevate their gaze as they enlarge their country. Avoid petty politics, Washington says, and practice the virtues that will sustain Republican government. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, Washington writes, religion and morality are indispensable supports. President Jefferson, like Washington before him, was the recipient of many congratulatory letters upon his election to the highest office in the land. In one case, congratulations came in the form of a mammoth cheese from Baptists in Massachusetts. The cheese, a gift made in gratitude for Jefferson's long-standing commitment to religious liberty, weighed in at over half a ton. The Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut made a more modest gift in the form of their letter. But they were aware of Jefferson's much earlier role in releasing their Baptist brethren in Virginia from the shackles of Anglican establishment and expressed their hopes that as president, Jefferson might similarly liberate them from the constraints the government of Connecticut put upon them. Exempt from the assessments that funded the established church, the Baptists nonetheless enjoyed their liberty not so much as a right, but as mere toleration. They wondered then at what point it might be revoked. Acknowledging that the president is, quote, not the national legislator, the Baptists in Connecticut nonetheless asked Jefferson to intervene on their behalf. With this historical context in mind, Jefferson's response to the Danbury Baptists, in which he employs the now famous metaphor of the wall of separation between church and state, reads not like a demand for the separation of religion and politics, as is so often indicated today. Rather, it displays recognition by Jefferson that the principle of federalism is of decisive importance. As president, Jefferson is disabled from interfering in the Connecticut church-state system. The First Amendment's religion clauses clearly disable Congress from interfering. That was the interpretation that prevailed then and that Jefferson put forward in his letter. He certainly wished Connecticut to accord full religious liberty to all its citizens as a matter of principle and not just toleration, but because the Constitution did not permit his interference, he would not intervene. The citizens of Connecticut must find a remedy to their situation by changing their state constitution and its statutes. In concluding his letter to the Baptists, President Jefferson, like President Washington in his letter to the Hebrew congregation, offered a benediction. I reciprocate your kind prayers for the protection and blessing of the common Father and Creator of man. The constitutional doctrine of incorporation, by which the First Amendment was applied against the states, and numerous other constitutional maneuvers beyond the scope of this presentation, have dramatically altered the shape of the contemporary church-state debate. The abandonment of federalism, the elevation of the Supreme Court to a level labeled by one scholar as the National School Board, and the resultant confusion in church-state case law should not obscure the fact that for the founders, religion and morality are the foundations of good government, and religious liberty is among our most precious possessions. Arguments about how many secular legal codes must be hung on a wall to counterbalance a public presentation of the Ten Commandments and thus achieve neutrality obscure the fact that the First Amendment makes no such demand of neutrality. Similarly, the idea that a nativity creche must be accompanied by Santa Claus or some other holiday symbol in order to achieve a requisite balance neglects the fact that the First Amendment makes no such demand for balance. The strange multi-pronged tests invented by the Supreme Court to make sense of the First Amendment have resulted in more confusion, not less. They act to obscure the central meaning of that amendment, which was that no national church could be established and no law restricting free exercise could be made by Congress. The separation of church and state was a revolutionary achievement of the American founding. And what the First Amendment set into motion, the disestablishment of state churches, marked a boon to liberty throughout the land. None of this meant, however, that the national government, or any state government for that matter, was severed from the religious realm. In proscribing a national church, the founders did not mean to say that churches and their members could not seek to influence politics. When they were at their best, the founders, in fact, modeled the way in which, on matters of religion and politics, citizens might influence their government, and elected officials might interact with citizens prudently, with the voice of reason, and with the utmost regard for the common good and attention to individual rights. For James Madison, as well as other leading founders, the most precious possession we have is our rights. As he outlines in a 1792 newspaper essay, it's in your readings, it's titled simply On Property. We understand the word property usually as material possessions. But in the most important sense, our property is immaterial. In a word, Madison writes, as a man is said to have a right to his property, he may be equally said to have a property in his rights. Material property and immaterial rights both must be protected by government. Here I quote again from Madison's piece. This being the end of government, that is a just government which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. Where an excess of power prevails, property of no sort is duly respected. No man is safe in his opinion, his person, his faculties, or his possessions. This being the end of government, that alone is a just government which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. This sentiment may strike contemporary ears as insufficiently attentive to the needs of the poor, or oblivious to injustices that leave some with more property than others. But Madison and his fellow founders were not interested in establishing a regime of rights so that one class of citizens might profit from the loss of another. They held, in fact, great concern for those of lesser means. That is not a just government, Madison wrote, nor is property secure under it, where the property which a man has in his personal safety and personal liberty is violated by arbitrary seizures of one class of citizens for the service of the rest. Madison's concern, he makes clear in his essay, and in his body of work as a whole, is for the poor and the rich both, that excessive taxes not grind down the poor, and that arbitrary taxes not plague the wealthy. He summarizes his argument this way, quote, if the United States mean to obtain or deserve the full praise due to wise and just governments, they will equally respect the rights of property and the property in rights. President Washington, too, was mindful of how the American understanding of liberty was not just the best one for his time, but was exemplary for all time and to all mankind. It was, Washington said, quote, an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. It is often said that the founders were men of their time, bound by its conventions and norms. Nothing shows how untrue this statement is more than the far-seeing and innovative gifts the founders gave to future generations of Americans in religious liberty as a matter of right, morality as connected to our national purpose, and property whose protection is the purpose of government.